Hello, everybody. My name is Rabab, and I am a member of the English division at Innopolis University. I have the pleasure today to introduce Professor Joseph Alexander Brown, who is a PhD holder and assistant professor, and IEEE senior member and the head of the Artificial Intelligence and Game Development Lab at Innopolis University. Today, we are going to talk about presentations for university students, and the title of today's meeting is Building a Better Presentation. Um, I would like to listen from Professor Brown. Over to you, Professor Brown, why you've chosen this topic, why it's important for our university students to build this skill, and why you've selected this time in particular to talk about it. Over to you, please.
Okay, so thanks, and hello everybody that's joining us either here or on the YouTube later on. So right now we're moving kind of into the end of the semester, and especially our third and fourth year and project courses are going to require some amount of presentational skills for them. So going in front and making a presentation about the project that you've been working on throughout either the term or throughout the past academic year. So that would probably be the key bit that makes this presentation so necessary at this time. But I think there's also throughout both university and just post-university, there's going to be job interviews. There's going to be pitch meetings. There's going to be early meetings inside of their careers that require ability to present. I know, for example, with my working career, when I first got out of university and went into industry, one of the things that they noticed and that they highlighted was my ability to make a presentation in front of staff and get across certain issues. So I was working with the engineering group, and every month there was a monthly meeting in which they would go through engineering issues. And so I was always the guy that had to give the group presentation of the engineers to the line workers on here are the various issues that we're having, and can you please help us, and here's how you can help us. So structuring the presentation in that way was a call to action to get them to do something to help us. And a lot of people have issues with walking in front of a crowd. A lot of people have issues with structuring arguments. A lot of people have issues of the oratory side of this, of speaking and presenting clearly so that people can understand what you want them to do and how you would like them to do it. And I think that the skill of presentations is an easily transferable skill set into industry, into job interviews, into daily life to be able to go through and deal with this. Public speaking is one of the most fearful actions that a human can do. They have made multiple different surveys of people and said, what is the thing that you fear most? And the number one response is public speaking. And this is a world that includes both lasers and sharks. So there's potential laser beams on sharks somewhere within the world. That to me sounds more fearful than public speaking, but public speaking is continuously number one in the list of fearful actions that someone can take. So the idea of this presentation today is to talk and answer your questions on giving better presentations and trying to remove some of the issues that happen inside of those presentations.
Thank you, Professor Brown. To start with, probably the first thing I would think about is what are the pillars of building the presentations that our students should be aware of, or any presenter should be aware of?
So what I would probably go with that is there is the oratory that's being used, that is how do you speak. There's the rhetoric, that is the arguments that are kind of being made. And there's also kind of this third, the third issue of kind of the externalities. So I can sound really good, but the argument could be completely poor. I could make a really good sounding argument, and the basis of it could be completely false. I could have a really, really good argument for why that thing happens, and I can present it in a very poor way. And there's also kind of this third externality issue, which is really anything that's not in the presentation or in the way that you deliver it. So what room am I delivering this in? The technology aspects of this, is my computer going to break down? What if the mic breaks? Is the room too hot? All of these can affect the presentation, which we only kind of usually look at from the perspective of just how are you speaking and what are you speaking about. So I think there's kind of those three pieces to it.
Right. So now, let's say I am a fourth year student preparing now for my thesis presentation. How would I go step by step towards structuring and preparing for my final presentation? How can I prepare for this? And what are your pieces of advice to me? What are your pieces of advice to me in order to get the best presentation to really win it?
So I think to start off, let's just go through what the process of that is, because I think it's important to know what is the goal and objective of that meeting. The idea of the thesis presentation is that there is about a 50-page document. A group of 3 defense examiners that have maybe read through the document, probably have only paged through it. And there is another standpoint of there's a time limitation on it. So you maybe only have 10 to 15 minutes in order to present that entire work that you've done over the course of a year. So it's very close also to like a conference presentation. Other than you then have the questioning of the examiners that are then trying to see whether the work is evaluatable as a pass or a fail in terms of the piece of it. So really what happens there is they're given a piece of the work ahead of time. Whether they've reviewed it or not is questionable, but they also get a report from the professor saying what grade would we expect this to have. And so really what's happening there is they're seeing whether the grade is acceptable or not. So that's kind of the process to it. So because of that process and that restricted time, a lot of the pieces of externalities are already kind of solved. You're going to be in a classroom. Your audience is going to be other students and the examination committee, with the examination committee being the key audience that you have to convince. You're going to have to be ready to answer questions from the audience and deflect those questions if there's anything that's hard to deal with. So that's one of those things where the externalities really build into the pieces of it. If we look at the presentational style, you only have about 10 to 15 minutes. So that's a real restriction on the time in which you can make an argument to get your point across. And people really have issues with short presentations. It's really easy to do a long, huge presentation on something with filler words and filling time in and adding stuff on. Yeah, it's really hard to kind of condense that into that space. Now, I've done, for example, ISW workshops. So this is a teacher's training segment, and we look at 10-minute lessons inside of our thing. So you have to teach someone something in 10 minutes. And people go, how can you teach something in 10 minutes? Well, look at YouTube. Look at YouTube presenters. Can they get through and get a message across in 10 minutes? Sure. In fact, they can probably do that really, really well, because that's what the timeline is on. About the minute timeline on YouTube is about 10 minutes to 15 minutes. So they don't have, they have to really condense that. It's very scripted. So, how do you fit then a normal sort of conversational type lecture into that timeline becomes a real challenge for new presenters. So part of it has to do with having a structure on the presentation and really hitting that sort of timeline and practice. There seems to be this weird idea that presenting is this natural, magical ability that a certain subset of the population has, and they're just wonderful presenters, and that this isn't built via practice. And like anything else, things are built via practice. So how do you get that practice time in becomes part of it, and what do you do during that practice time? So there's in that one question, Rabab, there's a lot of meat inside of it. So maybe should we break it down a bit? Like maybe before the presentation, during, and after, what the stages are?
Yes, probably. Yes,
Okay.
thank you so much. Probably, yes, we can start with this, especially we want to make life easier for this, like to make this fear really less, or maybe to diminish it for fourth year students or for any presenter. So how to prepare. So yes, let's start with the first stage. I am now preparing for my presentation. So what should I do? So the pre-stage, let's say.
So the first issue here is, what are you trying to get across? What is the purpose of the presentation? In the case of the thesis, it's very clear. I have to convince 3 people that I know what I'm doing. That's really what all defenses are. Convince the examination committee that you know what you're doing. So this means that you're taking a huge, giant work and you're trying to condense it down into what is the purpose of it. So if I want to convince you of something, what stages do you have in your mind? First of all, I have to show you that there is a problem to be solved. So if I wanted to say deal with coffee brewing techniques, right? I developed a new method of brewing coffee. What's the problem right now? Well, it takes too long to brew? Is it tastes bad when you brew it this way? What am I solving? And that really should be kind of what the purpose of the thesis is already. So you should have that marked down. So you're going to need at the start to tell people and bridge into the conversation, what is the problem? Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Brown. Today I want to talk to you about some issues with coffee. I find my coffee is too bitter. Do you have that experience as well? And focus on what's the problem. Wow, yeah, get them thinking. I don't like the bitterness that's in my coffee. And now that you've given them what the problem is, point out that you're going to then, over the course of this, solve this problem. Give them the objective of what you're trying to do in the presentation. We do not want to surprise people in a presentation usually. We want to have them flow through and listen to us and go, wow, I really want to hear what this guy has to say. So if you put the problem forward and show them very quickly, okay, this is the genesis of the solution, or we're going to look at it. For example, I'm going to talk to you today about bitterness in coffee, and I'm going to show you a method in order to solve that bitterness using saline. Okay, so we're going to put salt in the coffee. And you may think that salt in the coffee is a rather weird thing to do, right? Again, bring them along on the story. Okay, now, normally inside of a teaching lecture, we would also do some sort of pre-testing and see how people are in the room, but this can also be done visually. And this is where we then move into more of the kind of process of the learning inside of it. So we might go through and ask questions of the audience. You probably cannot do that inside of a student presentation very effectively to a group of examiners. But you can go through and talk about what the background of the problem is here, just to get everybody up to speed, right? In this case, there's been some other work on these other ways of making bitterness, but here's the issues with them. This is where you then get into kind of the actual presentation piece of it. And this is going through, okay, here's what our method was, here's what our results were, etc. And then you want to kind of check the understanding near the end. Give them an example of this against a real world outcome. Give them the presentation of the outcome. So you can see that here I have a cup of coffee and I've put some saline in it, and notice that the bitterness has dropped off. Then finally you want to summarize this and go back and say, hi everyone, at the start I told you we're going to look at coffee and we're going to look at bitterness, and we saw that via saline solution that this, so now I want you to go out and try this yourself. Thank you very much. And move into the questional stage. So a lot of this structure we use inside of the ISW, for example, is known as BOPs. So bridge in, objective, pretest, participatory learning, post-test, summary. The pre-test and the post-test are mostly for checking of understanding. So I want to check what understanding do they have coming into the room, and I want to check what do they know going out of it. Now, normally we do this maybe with a quiz or something like that, but if you're doing this inside of a presentation, you can still have a bit of a structure there in order to just ask a question, throw up a show of hands, great, moving on. Rabab, do you have any?
Right, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, since you've been talking about the element of time and how it's important to really have it within it, like this time limit, we've got a very interesting point from Andre, and he raised an issue about the how he said it would be really great to see a 3-minute presentation to teach and to copy and then to transpose to a longer one. And his question is there emotional aspect that we can teach in order to facilitate learning?
I definitely think that there are emotional aspects to learning. There's a number of studies that have said that our memories are based on emotions. So if you're fearful of something, if an event happens and you're scared, you're more likely to remember that event. Or if you're happy during that moment, you're more likely to remember that event. If you can think back even over the last week, how many events do you really remember? Do you remember what you ate for breakfast 3 days ago? Or did there have to be something associated with that to remember it? And if I can't remember what I had for breakfast 3 days ago, I know I must have ate breakfast because I think that was Monday, which was a teaching day. So I usually do have breakfast. So I don't really remember that. And this is another piece of, they've done various questions to especially judges inside of different presentations where they've done judging on competitions. And they come back to the judges like a year later and will say, what do you remember about that, presentation or that piece? And they just remember, well, I liked it. So at the time, maybe they were doing really close analysis to it, but over time, what really remembers is just the emotions that you had while it happened. And if you can trigger an emotional response in someone, you're more likely to have memory and you are more likely to have attention. This works both ways. You could also get people angry, and then they remember being angry at your presentation or remember your presentation because it upset them. So we probably don't want to upset our audience before it happens, even though that's an emotional response. We probably want to have something joyful or something where there's righteousness in whatever's happening. So if you look for appeals, right, you'll see this with a lot of like World Vision or various like animal things. Like they'll show you like, here's this emaciated child and you should give money. People remember those advertisements because it has an emaciated child, and that's shocking. Does it then make you do the thing that they want you to do? I don't know. But you definitely more likely to remember it. So yes, there's a lot of emotional aspects.
Right, thank you. So can we move now to the next step? It is, now we are during the presentation.
Yeah.
What should I keep in mind? And we always hear about the first couple of minutes, like the introduction, let's say. We always say, oh my God, like from the very beginning, that is not going to be that interesting. Like sometimes, let's say if people are attending conferences, from the first couple of minutes, they make like they decide whether to continue attending, or sometimes some people would leave or they would switch off. How can I really take care, very good care of my introduction? And how would it fit for a computer science student who would say, the subject is very dry. I don't think this would fit for me to make it an interesting presentation. So that is what I would.
And again, this gets back into even the emotional side of it. Walking into that room, it's very intimidating. It's incredibly intimidating. And I think one of the things that people don't understand when they see professors up at the front is the years of training that have gone into us being able to go up there and look like we know what we're doing when we don't. That's kind of the big secret here. It is stressful at the start of every lecture I have. It's a very stressful experience, because you're going into a room, as you can see here. Look at all those chairs that would be filled with students normally, right? It's a weird place to be. You're at the front of the room. Everybody's looking at you. Everybody's staring at you. Everybody is, you believe, judging you. Everybody is doing that. And so the anxiety kicks in. And I'm a rather anxious person just normally day to day. But people always say, oh, you seem so calm when you're presenting. It's like, yes, because I've had years of training in order to not show that. Just walking into that room, I would say part of it, there's always been the whole thing of, well, picture the audience naked. I don't think I can do that with students with the current PC world that we live in which, there's issues there. So my thing is, I listen to music before I go in. I try to zone myself in. Some professors have their different little rituals before a class. Some really like to look over the slides and make sure everything's picture perfect. I never like to touch my slide deck more than an hour before the lecture, because it just increases that anxiety. So a lot of this is trying to control the anxiety that you have. And this also comes out of in the presentation. When I'm anxious, I talk quicker. And that then moves through into the anxiousness. The issue here is not trying to stop the fact that you're going to be anxious or the fact that this is not feeling nice. The issue here is trying to control the behavioral aspects of what happens because of that. So what I mean by that is, you're not going to necessarily become comfortable in this process. But showing the confidence or the peace there is what we're usually trying to train. The way that you do that is through practice, and the way that you do that is also through giving the presentation beside an audience that you're confident with a lot of the time, or taping. Great athletes tape their performances and review the tape. Great presenters tape their presentations and review the tape. Because what you're looking for is, what does the other person see? There's lots of mistakes that I feel as if I have made when I'm presenting that nobody else sees, because it's not actually affecting them. And this goes back to the question of, what will you remember of the presentation? You're in this agitated state. You'll remember every little tiny thing and dwell on it. But probably your audience didn't necessarily see those issues, or remember them, or see them as problematic as you do. If you're going, every 5 seconds, yes, that is visible and is something that needs to be corrected for. But if you just do it once or twice, nobody's really going to notice or see that as outside of there. Or if you have a certain nervous tick, right? I rarely know what to do with my hands when I'm presenting. So I'll hold a pen or hold an object right? People use like it's basically like a security blanket sort of thing. So a lot of that having to do with the nervousness of walking into that room is having to do with practice. So Rabab, I'm sorry, I kind of went off on a tangent there. Let's go back to the question again.
Right. So how about well, you've already addressed the question, but I would say what are your pieces of advice for the introduction of the presentation,
yes, okay.
especially for a computer science learner?
Yes, because your question was mostly having to do with kind of like the start of this, and computer science is such a boring topic. Why would anyone want to listen to my presentation? Okay, you just did 4 months to 8 months of work on this topic. Do you find it boring? Maybe you do. I don't know. I don't think I could work on something for 4 to 8 months that I found uninteresting in some manner. And part of this is also the transference of that excitement, right? Like I love coming into class and talking about these really technical things, but I want to show my excitement of that. Don't feel as if you have to be the, hi everyone, welcome to my presentation. Show the emotion that you have for it. You know, I'm really glad to see this many people inside of the room today talking about presentations and listening about it. And I love watching really good presentations. And even if I don't know anything about the topic and I don't really care about it, or it's something that's, you know, outside of it, I can really see that this person really loves this thing and really understands this thing. So you're passing on that, if this person is so excited and interested in it, maybe I should too.
Interesting. There is a question now about repetition from Nikolai, and he's saying there is a method to repeat statements 3 to 7 times over the presentation in order to make the argument understood and retained. Would you recommend that repetition?
I would say if it's the objective of the talk, then it depends on how it's done. I've seen one thing that I absolutely hate personally, going to a lot of academic conferences, and that I try to avoid, is let's go back to the outline slide, or let's give an outline of the talk. You know, it'd always be, hi everyone, nice to see you. I'm working on this problem. Let's go through what I'm going to do. First, I'm going to explain the problem. Then I'm going to talk about my method for solving the problem. Then I'm going to, and then you go back and then it's like, okay, now we're talking about this. And that gets really horribly repetitious because it's like, yes, I understand that there will be some format to this presentation. Now, say that I was going through inside of a presentation to a classroom and the class is 40 minutes to 45 minutes for a half of the class. And I usually try to build my classes on a 45-minute and then break and then 45-minute. I might repeat something 3 to 7 times over the course of that, but it'll usually be whatever the main thing is I'm trying to accomplish in that class is. So I might say something like, so remember our goal is to do X. And then I go through the slide pointing and referring back to that objective. Now, in a 10 to 15-minute talk about a problem, 3 to 7 times of presenting that remember this might not be appropriate. So I think this is really, it depends on what are you repeating and what's the goal and action that you're repeating, from my perspective, Andre.
Right. And Nicolas asking for a short 10 to 15-minute talk, would it be best for students to script and memorize the entire talk? And especially like when you talk about the question and answer section.
So again, I think this is a mileage may vary issue. When you memorize the talk and memorize what's going to happen, you reduce some of the emotion and the actions that are inside of it. And you can also go into this kind of haze of not responding to the audience when they don't understand something. So if I'm looking at my audience and I'm getting these kind of quizzical stares after I make a statement, I might want to refine the statement and go back and revisit it. It's kind of a dependent upon the person. Some people need to do that just to get through it because of their anxiety. My argument would be maybe you don't script it, but have more of kind of an outline of some, and maybe some key sentences that you're going to lead into and try to get to those. If this is like the first time that you've done this presentation, okay, go through, do it as a speech for the first few times, but then try to get off book. So by off book, I mean like in the stage acting, if you're practicing, say, Hamlet, your goal is to learn Hamlet to the point where you do not require the book while you're on stage reading it. You're just doing it from memory. But this is a little bit even beyond off book in that you're also trying to come up with how to say it differently every time that you do it. You know, we're right. Trying to look like humans when we're presenting, not robots. Go ahead.
Sure. Right. Probably Nicola is addressing a very interesting section here, which is the question and answer. And I believe that most students, and I remember, like, yes, when we want to give a presentation, it worries us, the question and answer, because you can say, I can memorize what I have really prepared. I know what my presentation is all about. But what can scare me, or what can really be the unpredictable section, is this question and answer. How can I be prepared for this? Yes, I know there can be, like, I would practice, but how would I really have enough confidence on this section? And what if I was asked a question and I couldn't really manage to answer it? So what would you advise us about this section? Because sometimes you cannot really tell what questions you might have.
So this is moving outside of, the presentation side, where I can pre-prepare and have things ready, and moving it more into just talking to someone. I think part of that for the how to deal with question and answers appropriately gets back to, you're the domain expert on your thesis. Nobody knows more about what you did in your thesis than you did. Unless there's some sort of plagiarism or cheating or something along those lines. But from the perspective of, if you did the work, then you are the expert of that domain. And they are honestly asking these questions to understand more about it. So from a confidence perspective, you're the number one person that did this thesis. Okay. Now, specific questions inside of it might move outside of your domain expertness and might move into some other piece, or maybe there's a piece that's missing. I'm going to give you a few key tips when it comes to answering questions. The first one is, it's okay to ask for the question to be refined of an examiner. If you do not understand the question, you can go back to the examiner and say, do you mean X or Y? That's fine.
Would this decrease my grade? Because sometimes it doesn't.
I'm sorry?
Would this decrease my grade at...
No, it's just I'm not quite understanding if you meant the question as blah or as blah.
Right.
Right?
And that would have nothing to do with... Yeah. It wouldn't influence my grade to ask again.
Just a clarification of the question? No.
Right.
No, I would if I asked a question and a student asked, do you mean X or mean Y? Then I would see that as, okay, they're probably just not understanding the question. Now, if it happens multiple times, I would see it, oh, okay, they don't know and they're doing a delay tactic. But if you're honestly trying to understand the question deeper, or you think that you have an answer, but it could be this or that, let me know what your assumptions are. Right? Let me know, okay, assuming this is the case, then So many people don't seem to realize that. when you're asked a question and it sounds like a yes or no, and the answer is maybe, you can respond maybe and give that. This isn't a trial. This isn't a trial from that perspective, right? You are allowed to clarify and move out deeper. The other bit of this, and this astounds students and especially graduate students, and you learn this the hard way when you don't know this, is I don't know is a completely valid answer to a question in science. I don't know. Should we use this or do that? I don't know. It's something that requires empirical testing. Now, once you've said, I don't know, go beyond that. You can't just stop, because the next question from the examiner is, how would you find that out? That's, if I say to a student, okay, here's my question, and they go, I don't know. Okay, well, give me a process for how you would go about finding that out, right? You haven't run every experiment on the thing. You haven't done this. You haven't done that. So instead of trying to, trick me and say, oh, well, if we did it this way, and then they go off on some big long tangent, and then what you they're just trying to, trick me. Don't trick the examiner into showing knowledge that you don't have. Just say, I don't know. That would be an excellent experiment that we could try out in the following way. Or that's something that would require future experimentation. And here's how we would go about it. Or, you know what? I can't quite remember the formula for that right now. I believe it's in the document about this point, but I would have to get back to you later. And then go and find it after the examination and say, there's where it is to them. Right? People forget things. People don't know things. We don't expect that everybody knows every single thing in terms of the answers. Give me a speculation, but let me know that it is speculation and not just, and not that you're trying to trick me into saying that you know how it's done. So I don't know is a wonderful place to be in science. I don't know is where all science begins, is from I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that's very helpful, and it makes us feel more confident, because yes, sometimes if you do not know, you'll have to really say it better than just claiming that you know. We have an issue, like a question from Andre, and he said, I remember that I wrote my PhD thesis defense and I've learned it. He has learned it by heart, but he usually doesn't do this. But he said that was very helpful in the very beginning. He said, would you recommend writing down this speech to the students? Like, do you recommend this to students during their presentations? Can they write it down?
So, to pre-write the speech and have it ahead of time, I think for somebody doing their first presentation, that might be helpful. Or for early presentations, that might be helpful. At least, I would say, have an outline written down. Like, this is what I'm going to do first, this is what I'm going to do second, this is what I'm going to do third. And I think this is another piece that people don't realize about PowerPoint and PowerPoint slides and all of this, is we seem to have this affliction to using PowerPoint slides for write the entire speech that you're going to give. But a lot of it has to do with, that's where the outline of what you're talking about. The focus should not necessarily be on your PowerPoint slides. It should be on you giving the presentation.
Right. We also have some point shared by Nikolai. He said some presenters, including students, sometimes think that they didn't do enough, as they might have more ideas, and so they didn't have time to implement, which affects the way they present. So is there a method for a presenter to convince themselves to appreciate the work they've done to present with more confidence?
Well, I think there's an issue here of convincing yourself that you've done enough work, as well as convincing others that you've done enough work in the examination. I have to convince an examiner. I don't have to convince myself. So one thing that I always, again, find annoying when I'm watching student presentations is when right at the start, they're apologizing for the work they did. I think we've all come into that presentation. And the first thing out of their words is, I'm sorry that and this is only a small offering to you. It sounds like something like they're going before God and they're saying like all of their, it's like confessional of all the sins that they have made before they've even presented the work that they've made. And I think there's this thing called future work, and it's usually at the end of stuff rather than at the beginning. So I think part of it is just also the structure. You know, don't apologize for the work that you've done, even if you don't believe it to be enough, to the examiners. That's a great way to start in my head. This will be poor, because what you're saying is this will be poor. So what's my belief? You yourself are coming in and saying, man, this is going to be terrible, and I apologize for even doing it. Okay, I'll give you the F. You can leave. Save me the presentation. So avoid that. Don't do that. Show me legitimately. I think there's another piece of this, and that is, if you do not complete what you set out to do in science, and you fail at what you plan to do in science, that's not necessarily a failure of yourself as a scientist. And what I mean by that is, I could set out that I'm going to, I write my proposal and I say, I'm going to cure cancer. Well, that's a huge, giant problem. And of course, everybody has these scope things, right, where they scope way too big. And half of the faculty's job is just to make it come in, right? That's mostly what we're doing inside of our thesis meetings, is going, no, you got to scope in, no, you got to scope in, no, you got to scope in, no, you got to scope in. At least that's my experience. So with that, this is where that creep happens, where we're moving from, we're going to solve all of cancer. I had a process engineer when I worked in industry, and he used to say, I'm not here to solve world hunger. I'm here to give a guy a sandwich. You know, there's all these problems within the plant. There's all sorts of quality issues. I can't have every part be perfect, but I'm here to make sure that, you know, a certain percentage is saved. I'm here to give a guy a sandwich rather than solve world hunger. That's science right now. And this is undergraduate students under a 4 to 8 month period. That's very short. So the expectations of what can get done in that period, they need to be reasonable from both the student and the presenter, from the examiner. And so because of this, don't sell yourself short right off the bat and say to everyone, okay, tell me what you've done. Let me know what you've done. Let the examiners decide whether that's enough. But don't take it upon yourself to tell me right off the bat that you haven't done enough, because you're just setting yourself up then for failure. You're literally just telling me, hi, everyone, I failed. So at least that's my perspective with it. As for how do you convince someone of that?
Yeah. Yeah. Having talked about failure, we hope we would just talk about success. But since, yes, there can be some bad presentations. When would you fail a presentation? When, sometimes as instructors, we just see a lot of efforts put in a certain work, and the student cannot really put this into a real presentation. And so, yes, when it comes there, and you just say, I cannot really pass this presentation, or the student, let's say, when would you fail a presentation? When would you say this is a bad presentation?
So So this is kind of a hard because there's lots of things that can lead down this path, but it definitely has to be to a point where a lot of the times when I see what I would call a failing presentation, and where I would mark it as just abject failure, is when it's long, when there's no structure, when there's no proper etiquette to what's happening. I think the worst presentation that I have ever seen done was actually a presenter. He was a professor from somewhere in China that had come over to a presentation at the University of Montreal. And he was some big, of course, somebody with this big fancy title or whatever, and got his paper in. And the thing was just heavy, 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 heavy math. And the entire presentation was him facing the board, speaking through the math to the board for about 20 minutes for a 10-minute presentation, and just before lunch. That was the worst, because everybody's just in there like, I don't want to be here now. And people were getting up and leaving. I only didn't get up and leave because I was the presentation. Actually, he had two in that session, and both were exactly alike. And I nearly didn't even really have time to put mine in. So part of it is also understanding, okay, there's a time limit of this. Let's meet with that. There's a certain way that you present, and that is not putting your back to the audience and talking through math for 20 minutes. There's a lot of things that are completely forgivable inside of a presentation that I would not necessarily, I would comment upon them. Would I deduct marks? Maybe, maybe not, depending on how egregious they are. Like, I'm not going to deduct marks because somebody's up there and is nervous. I don't find that very fair because it's not something that is controllable necessarily. But I would if it's the slides are completely miscombobulated and elements are all over the place. I would if the presentation continues on for 30 minutes when it's supposed to be 15. Because those are things you can control via setting up the structure, setting up this. You can't necessarily control your speech patterns. You can't necessarily control what you do when you're nervous. You can't necessarily control body tics, things like that. I will remark on them as areas of potential improvement, but I don't think that those are ones where I would grade against it. Some professors will.
Right. Again, Andre is sharing one of the typical structures of a presentation when you start with the argument and then you go to the conclusion. And he is wondering whether you would recommend this pyramid as a structure to be adequate for the thesis defense.
So I think that's the normal situation, but he gives another one, right? So you start from the arguments and get to the conclusions. That's usually the process by which all of the writing is. In this case, he's saying...
Yes, so actually, so this is the typical, so he's saying starting from the conclusion, and developing the argument afterwards. Yes, that's my fault, sorry.
I think at this point, it would probably be better for students to follow the first structure. Just from the standpoint of there's more examples of that structure. I would rather have them walk before they can run. I've seen really, really, really good presentations that don't tell you what the presentation is about until the end of the presentation. Amazing presentations that do that, where you're almost solving a murder mystery and at the end, surprise! If you watch a lot of TED Talks, they'll try to do this with various levels of effectiveness. Would I ever want to see that from a first-year student? Probably not. Or from a thesis defense? Probably not. Because it's very hard to set up, and it requires kind of walking in that there's a certain amount of impetus for it. You have to remember that in this case, this presentation here, it's not that any presentation doesn't come with a certain risk-reward ratio, even today. There's a certain risk-reward ratio in how I act and what I say and etc. But there's definitely a less risk-reward ratio than me putting my degree on the line if this presentation goes well or bad. So in that case, I would probably try to stick to things that are well known and that I'm not going to confuse my audience. The key here is don't lose the audience.
Right. Thank you. Probably, I'm not sure if the time would allow for more questions, but probably we can just try to wrap it up with you. So again, Professor Brown, if we just want to go over the main points, what really builds the best scenario of an effective presentation? So what would you advise our fourth-year students now before their thesis and generally in any presentation?
I'm going to give you the default professor answer, and that's start early is the first part. That's pretty much the default answer to anything in academia, is start early. Second bit of this is have the structure together, have the outline together. And the other piece of this is practice. Practice, 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 practice. And when you're done with that, practice. When I have graduate students who are going off to conferences, they very, very rarely have that conference be their first presentation of that work. There's usually a lab presentation that they'll do where it's myself and the other people in the lab. And I will tell you, that is the worst presentation that they will ever give. Because I set out to kill them. Because I would rather tell them what the problems are in the presentation in a zero risk situation than I would inside of an actual international conference. So we used to have these, when I was going through my PhD, we used to call them murder panels. And what would happen is that all of the graduate students in the lab, you would show up to give your presentation, and they would all have their notebooks out, and you do the exact same presentation that you're going to give for your thesis defense or for your presentation at the big conference, etc. And they would rip it apart at the end, right? There's no slide numbers on number 5. This figure's blurry. I didn't like the way that you did this, right? They do that sort of thing. And then when you got into the actual room, shoot, you've already been through it. Sports, they watch tape. Michael Jordan sits down, he watches tape. He will watch through, and the basketball games, they will analyze it till they're blue in the mouth. That's the majority of the time that's not spent actually practicing on the court or on the game is watching tape. Lawyers, right? We would think that that's a very important place to do proper oratory. Lawyers, when they're training, they do what they call moot court. They have a case, they go, they present the case, and they practice their trial techniques when there's no risk. So constant practice and presentations, tape it, get your friends there, tell them this is going to be bad, sure, whatever, have them tear it apart. Absolutely tear it apart. Go to your thesis supervisor and say, look, can I give this presentation before the official marked one, just so we can go through it and see if there's any changes that you'd like me to make, and do that presentation. And right now, shoot, we're on Zoom, right? It's a little bit easier in a way, because we're already having to kind of do all of this, right? We're now a little bit more used to being on tape. And go back and review your own tape, because that's the best way to see behavioral issues. If you think, oh man, I really messed up on that part, go back and watch the tape. Maybe you did, maybe you didn't. Maybe there's something inside of there that you didn't see before, right? When I did my own ISW, they put us through 9 to become a trainer in the ISW. which is where we do these rounds of mini presentations. And Rabab, you've gone through this process as well. You go through
Yes,
and
sure.
do the presentations. To get to the trainer level, you have to go through 9 presentations in total over the course of being an ISW, your ISW cert, your facilitator cert, and your trainer cert. They go through 9 cycles of that, of giving a 10-minute presentation in front of the group, having it taped, going back, getting feedback, and we talk about how to give good feedback, and then you give feedback on everybody else in the piece. So that's 90 minutes of presentations that I have given in order to gain that certification, where I have a tape on me. And the tape tells you so much. If I can go and get my VCR tape from Canada, maybe I'll bring it one day, and we can watch my first presentations. And those are some of the first presentations I ever gave to the type of group, because that was inside of my master's, just finishing it. And you will see all sorts of bad habits, of verbal tics, of hesitations, of fast talking. And I still have some of those things, and I still behaviorally try to control those inside of my lectures. So this isn't something where it's solved in one presentation. Oh, I've practiced it once and I feel okay. That takes a lot of time to get to that point. But it's really worth the time that you put into it, because then you can go out and give presentations like this. Like, I'm coming into this, I have no idea what questions I'm going to be asked. There could be all sorts of different issues. You know, we didn't even get into some of the issues of what happens when the projector fails and all of that. There's lots more that we can talk about that, and how to deal with those. But I'm a lot more confident in my presentational skills, mostly because I've done it a lot.
Right. Thank you so much, Professor Brown. I'm not sure if we've got more questions, but I'm not sure the time would allow for more. Probably I can, by the very end of this talk, thank you so much for this very useful, very interesting talk, which I am sure is going to be very useful for our fourth-year students, for anybody who's going to prepare for their presentations, including me. Thank you so much for you, Professor Brown. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to our audience for the very useful contribution today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the interview, and thank you for taking this time. Hamna Islam and I have written a new book. It's on various issues inside of playtesting, how to effectively use dice, and other ways that you can make board games much more fun for your players. If you're interested, then go and check it out here.